Hi friends, welcome back to the Period Recovery DIY Starter Guide. I am sorry, but the last one was a little bit longer than I had anticipated, but we're back at it for our very last one. And I'm going to wrap up by talking about how do you track your progress in recovery. So charting is going to help us move beyond the guesswork and emotions that, oh, I think what I'm doing is right, to be able to see clear progress that the changes you're making are actually working. So we're going to talk about how to take your temperature accurately, how to observe and record changes in your cervical mucus, and how to actually interpret then what your chart is showing you so that you can recognize the phases of your cycle, celebrate your improvements, and troubleshoot when things aren't working. So let's dive in. As always, before we start, I just want to mention that again, I'm a certified holistic hypothalamic amenorrhea practitioner, but not your doctor and not your practitioner, which means this information is generalized and just for educational purposes. Always consult your healthcare provider for any kind of diagnosis or treatment. And if you want more specific guidance for your journey, again, I offer my private coaching program. So today we're going to start by talking about how and why we chart, why it's such a valuable part of period recovery. Then we'll talk about how we can use that data as evidence, whether you're getting closer to restoring your cycle. And then we'll talk about what you can expect early on in recovery, and then how to troubleshoot when your cycles aren't quite where you want them to be, even after you get your cycle back. So why should you chart? We track temperature and cervical mucus in period recovery because it gives us a really good picture of what's going on in your body. It helps establish a starting point so we can see where are you starting right now and then use it to measure your progress as you move forward. It also gives us evidence that the changes you're making are actually working. We're not just like throwing things at the wall and seeing if it sticks. And often I find in period recovery, like your hormones are going crazy, and so therefore your feelings are all over the place. One day it might feel like nothing's happening, and then the next day your temperature has spiked. So this data can be really helpful to just show us facts. It also helps us see more details that you couldn't tell on the outside. So details about the different phases of your cycle and the quality of those phases as well. And that allows us to be able to fine tune recommendations to optimize each phase of your cycle. And so for those who are thinking about pregnancy, it's super useful because you can use that data that we're getting about your cycle to help you either get pregnant or also to help you avoid pregnancy if your goal is that you want to get your cycle back but you don't want to get pregnant right away. So let's start with talking about how to temp. So to track your temperature, you don't need anything fancy. You don't need expensive femtech. It's actually going to be less helpful in period recovery. You just need a basic basal body thermometer that's going to track your temperature to 2 decimal places. And then you'll need some kind of phone so you can get the Kandara app, or you could also paper chart as well if you'd rather. So in terms of how you take your temperature, it's easy, but it's important that you do it right. When you wake up, before getting out of bed, place your thermometer just under your tongue and let it sit there for about 5 minutes before turning it on to get an accurate reading. That 5 minutes is really important. I know it's annoying sometimes, but if you don't, you will find your temperatures are going to be like super all over the place or maybe really low because if your bedroom was cold, it didn't warm up at all. And so it's starting really cold. So after the 5 minutes, press start, take your temperature, take it once, don't take it 5 more times after that, and then record it in Kandara. For it to be considered an accurate reading, you need at least 5 hours of uninterrupted sleep. So if that doesn't happen because you got up during the night because you had to pee, still record your temperature, but there's a button on Kandara that you can mark it as questionable, just so that we have that information. Try to also take your temperature as much as possible the same time each morning. So like if you normally get up at 7 o'clock, try to take it 7 o'clock even on the weekends if you can. Don't get up, don't go to the bathroom, eat or drink anything before you do your temperature. And then if you're sick or if you maybe had alcohol the night before or you were just up and tossing and turning all night, still take your temperature and record it, but just mark it as questionable just because it's not going to be as accurate. So there's kind of two things we track. We track your temperature and then we also want to track your cervical mucus. And so cervical mucus in a typical menstrual cycle, we would see both dry days and then mucus days. The mucus days or the mucus phase of your cycle is what we'd call your fertile window. This is when your follicles are developing and estrogen rises to prepare for ovulation. And then cervical mucus normally shows up about 3 to 5 days before you ovulate, and really its job is there to keep your sperm alive. And without it, your uterus is really dry and hostile to sperm. You'll notice when you're in period recovery, you're probably going to be dry most of the time until your body starts producing some more estrogen. As you get closer to ovulation, the amount of mucus will increase, but also its consistency will change as well. Early on, it might start kind of creamy or lotion-like, and that's what it's doing there is it's meant to trap the sperm and to keep it safe until you ovulate. But then when you're getting really close to ovulation, it becomes more egg white and stretchy or even wet. And its purpose has changed then. It actually is then to help their sperm travel up toward the egg. It's really incredible. Like mucus is designed to have this perfect pH to keep your sperm alive and to be able to sort out between normal and abnormal sperm. And if you Google like peak and non-peak mucus, like under a microscope, you'll actually see the difference in the way like non-peak is gonna have like little I don't know, like cabins, I want to say, for it to stay in, and then it's gonna be more like straight shoots when it's peak mucus. It's kind of amazing how our bodies work. So you'll be recording your cervical mucus as well in Kandara, so it's all in one spot, which is super nice. And tracking it at first can feel really weird and uncomfortable and also sometimes hard to identify, but you do get better with practice. Basically, my recommendation is when you go to the bathroom, start by just looking at your underwear to see if there's any visible mucus there. And then fold the toilet paper and just wipe front to back before you pee. And you don't need to like check inside yourself or anything like that. And then just look at the toilet paper and note if there's any mucus and what the texture and consistency are like. In Kandara, there's a couple different ways you can classify your mucus. So there's sticky, creamy, watery, egg white. So try to do your best to choose which one of those it is. And if you're not sure, if it doesn't completely gross you out, there's actually a website. It's called the CM Project. And it really is on like people's fingers. I'm showing you what different kinds of cervical mucus looks like. So you can kind of compare yours and see if it's right. So that's there if you want it. It grosses some people out, but it can actually be really helpful. And it's also make sure when you record it in Kandara, you're recording the most fertile sign each day. So maybe you're going to be a little bit drier in the morning, but you notice some creamy mucus later on. Make sure you record the creamy mucus. And then after ovulation, we should see that cervical mucus dry up because progesterone causes it to dry up. And if it doesn't, that can be a sign of low progesterone. So you'll see there kind of on the chart. I'll talk about how you know when you ovulated, but you'll see kind of where I have the bars and they're increasing and then suddenly they drop off. That's because that's showing after ovulation, there's no more cervical mucus. So that's what you can expect it to look like in Kandara. So now let's talk about how you actually interpret that chart on Kandara. I'm going to go through and discuss first what a healthy menstrual cycle should look like, and then we can compare it to HA so you can know where the differences lie and know where you're trying to get to. So a typical menstrual cycle should last somewhere between 24 and 35 days. And it really should be consistent for each person, cycle to cycle, but some people are just going to have slightly longer, slightly shorter cycles. The cycle can be broken down into basically 4 phases: menstruation, the pre-ovulatory or follicular phase, ovulation, and the post-ovulatory luteal phase. And I should say menstruation kind of happens in the follicular phase, as you can tell by the chart there. But we'll say it's the 4 phases for what we're doing today. During your pre-ovulatory phase, your temperatures are going to be lower. They're normally above 36.3 degrees Celsius or 97.4 degrees Fahrenheit. And then ovulation is when your temperature rises to being above 36.7 or 36.8 degrees Celsius or 97.8 degrees Fahrenheit. How you confirm that you have actually ovulated is when you see 3 temperatures that are higher than your previous 6 normal temperatures, not your questionable temperatures, but 3 that are higher than the previous 6. And then what we'd expect is if you're pregnant is that these temperatures continue to stay elevated after ovulation past like your 14 days of your typical luteal phase. So let's actually talk about each of those phases in a little bit more detail. So the first one is menstruation, and you can see it there on both the chart of the hormones and then the chart as well on Kandara. And I'm going to start here, even though technically you need all the other phases to happen before you can get a bleed. But menstruation typically will last somewhere between 3 to 7 days. It's going to start heavier and then become lighter as your period progresses. And the color of your blood may start as like a deep red and then turn to more of like a brown towards the end because it's just older blood. And on average, you lose about 25 to 80 milliliters of blood, which is roughly equivalent to 3 to 4 tampons per day. You may have a small amount of pain, especially in your first few cycles as your body's just figuring itself out, but it really should get better. And beyond that, pain in your period, like intense pain, is not normal and it could be a sign of inflammation. And just one other thing I want to note is that if you have spotting, that's not actually the first day of your period. So if you have a little bit of spotting, but then the next day you get that full bleed, it's that day of the full bleed that you should mark as like actually your period starting. Just mark it as spotting when you're on Kandara. So our next phase is our follicular phase or pre-ovulatory phase. And this basically starts from the day you get your period until your temperature shows your sustained shift. And in this phase, as I said, your temperatures they should be above 36.3. Lower than that is a sign of low metabolism and low hormones. This phase typically should last somewhere between 14 and 25 days. And at some point, cervical mucus appears during this window, which is going to mark your fertile window, which is really when the sperm can stay alive to get pregnant. That's normally going to last anywhere between 2 to 7 days, but 3 to 5 is most common. And it's during this phase that your mucus is going to change from non-peak to peak mucus. So from creamy and lotion-like to more of like an egg white or watery. And for some people, they'll really see that progression. And for other people, they're just going to be dry, peak mucus. And so it'll just be a little bit different for everyone. But I will say once you get peak mucus, you know you have peak mucus. Like it's slippery, it's egg whitey, it's intense. The length of this phase is going to vary the most from cycle to cycle, and it's going to be the part that's really susceptible to things like stress, either through your diet or through exercise. Your luteal phase is really not what should be changing so much. Moving on to the big event, ovulation, there's actually not too much to say about it. What happens is when estrogen is high enough from your follicles producing it, LH is going to surge, which is what you're testing when you test on an OPK. And then after that, you'll typically ovulate within 12 to 36 hours. And then if you are observing cervical mucus, this is typically going to happen 1 to 2 days or sometimes even 3 days after you observe your peak mucus. And with all that said, in HA, you may think you observe peak mucus or just like a lot of mucus over time, but it still might not be quite enough to get you over that ovulation hump. So you're going to be like, why am I still seeing this? Why am I still seeing this? Why haven't I ovulated? But just because your body still needs, that next little like push to get it over the hump to actually ovulate. Finally, talking about the luteal phase, after ovulation, the follicle that released your egg becomes what we call your corpus luteum, which produces progesterone. And you'll see that on the bottom of the chart there with the hormones. You'll see that you have your developing follicle and then becoming your corpus luteum, which essentially just means yellow body. That's why I have it yellow there. So that's what's producing progesterone. And if estrogen was low during the follicular phase, which is often we see a longer than normal follicular phase when that happens, this can actually impact the health of your corpus luteum, making your progesterone production also lower. But the luteal phase is the phase that really should be changing the least. During this time, your temperature is going to go above 36.7 or 8 degrees Celsius, which is 97.8 Fahrenheit. And it's going to start, the luteal phase starts on your first day of confirmed ovulation and then continues until the day of your next period. And for pregnancy to be possible, this phase needs to be at least 10 to 11 days with an average of about 13 days. And then as well, we shouldn't be seeing any cervical mucus in this phase. If you are seeing it, it's a sign of low progesterone. So in terms of what to expect when you start tracking your progress in period recovery, start by collecting data and just wait at least 2 weeks before you start to really analyze your chart. You need to gather a baseline of information first. After that, we can begin to see where exactly you are at in recovery. So early on, we may expect to see really low temperatures, so something below 36.3 degrees Celsius, 97.4 Fahrenheit. and probably not a whole lot of cervical mucus. This happens because your body is producing very little estrogen and it has slowed down a lot to conserve energy. After this, you may start to see some erratic temperatures with some high and some low readings. And it's important to, one, make sure you're reading correctly, but these erratic temperatures could also just be that your body is trying to recover. Think of it like, the little engine that could chugging along saying, I think I can, but it just still doesn't have enough energy. It's also at this time you might start to see some cervical mucus that can be really exciting. And while that's a great sign, it's important, like, don't think you're going to ovulate the next day necessarily. We often see cervical mucus appear fairly early in recovery and just be fairly inconsistent at first because it actually takes 90 days for a follicle to fully mature. So depending on how far into recovery you were before you actually started charting, this can take some time. And then when you get your first cycle, exciting, but it's likely going to have a fairly short luteal phase because the corpus luteum just might not be healthy enough to produce sufficient progesterone. And this isn't always the case, but just don't be discouraged if that happens. Your period may also be lighter than usual, and you may notice that going into your next cycle, you have, again, consistent cervical mucus for a long time before you actually ovulate again. These cycles can be quite long at first, sometimes 45 days or more. And our goal is how can we shorten them? So really fine tuning your nutrition, your exercise to optimize them. Which brings me to troubleshooting, the different issues you might have in period recovery. The first thing I want to say is that when you're tracking and you would get one single low or odd temperature, don't stress about that. What we care about is the trend. But one of the problems that we notice in period recovery is a lot of cervical mucus over time. It just keeps coming, but we just never ovulate. So maybe you're seeing it for 1 to 2 months. And that's a sign that your body just doesn't have enough estrogen to trigger that big surge of LH. And in most cases, this comes back to an energy imbalance. The hypothalamus isn't sending strong enough signals because it doesn't feel safe, which often means you need more food and less exercise. Not what you might have wanted to hear, but it is true. So ask yourself, am I eating enough carbs? Am I eating enough fats? Am I still holding tightly to my exercise? And those sorts of questions and that recommendation is going to be the exact same as if you're having a really long follicular phase after your first period. Maybe you jumped right back into exercise. We recommend have 3 good, healthy length cycles before you bring back any exercise or any changes from what you were doing before when you got your period. So that's talking about a really long follicular phase, but the next set of issues has to deal with your luteal phase. So maybe you're having spotting in your luteal phase. Maybe it's just really short, it's only a couple days, or it's less than that, 11 days. Maybe you have cervical mucus during this phase, or that your temperatures are quite low after you ovulate. And when that happens, it's important to step back and evaluate, again, your eating and exercise habits, because it might be that your follicular phase was just too long and your corpus luteum just wasn't healthy enough. But there's actually other things with your luteal phase we can try to do as well. So some things that can move the needle include maybe increasing your protein to make sure you're getting enough. Vitamin C has been another one that has been shown to be really helpful, and cutting back on caffeine. So those are kind of the 3 things I'd recommend to a client if they're having luteal phase issues, besides just your general, are you eating enough variety, your timing, all that stuff. Consider your protein, your vitamin C, and then maybe cutting down on caffeine. And the biggest thing to remember is that lifestyle changes may take a little time to actually show up on your chart. So just pick one thing to adjust, give it a couple weeks doing it consistently, and then see, did your chart respond well or not? So, believe it or not, this one was a little bit shorter, but that's what I have for you. So I hope you found this series helpful on just kind of giving you some starting points on how to get your period back. You've taken a huge step by just learning and starting to implement these changes. And there's a lot of information here, so my encouragement would be to take 1 or 2 things to focus on and then check back in with yourself in a month to see how you're doing and what else you might want to adjust. My heart here by providing this information isn't just to push you into coaching. If this information is all you needed to get your period back, I'm genuinely so happy for you. And if you do recover, I'd love to hear about it and be able to celebrate with you. But if you would like more support, you can always check out my blog or my podcast where I try to share ongoing encouragement and practical tips. And if the mental hurdles still feel overwhelming, or if you'd like personalized recommendations for your specific situation, don't hesitate to reach out for coaching. You don't have to walk this road alone. Healing your cycle takes time and it takes patience. Celebrate the progress you're making and remember that you're not alone on this journey. I'm rooting for you.